Midnight bus to nowhere. It was a frigid October night when Emma found herself standing at an unfamiliar bus stop on the outskirts of town. Her phone was dead, her feet aching from hours of walking after her car had broken down miles back. The last sliver of hope flickered in the form of a dim street lamp, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked sidewalk and the metal bench. The timetable posted beside the stop was ancient, its ink faded and smudged. All Emma could make out was that the next bus was due at midnight, an hour from now. She glanced around uneasily. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept them along the deserted road. As she sat on the bench, the feeling of being watched began to creep in. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows stretching into obscurity. She told herself it was her imagination, but her unease refused to subside. At exactly midnight, the bus appeared, its headlights piercing through the fog that had rolled in seemingly out of nowhere. The vehicle was old, its once bright paint dulled and chipped. The destination display above the windshield read, in flickering letters, "Nowhere." Emma hesitated, but with no other options and the night growing colder, she climbed aboard. The door creaked shut behind her, and the bus lurched forward before she even found a seat. Inside, the bus was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The seats were a mix of faded upholstery and cracked vinyl. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. There were only a few other passengers, each sitting in isolated silence. None of them looked at her. Emma chose a seat near the middle, her unease growing with every passing second. She glanced at the driver, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. His expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. As the bus rolled through the foggy streets, Emma noticed something strange. The buildings outside seemed unfamiliar, even though she'd lived in the area her whole life. The streets twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, and the street signs bore names she didn't recognize. She leaned toward the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The other passengers began to unnerve her. A man in a tattered suit muttered to himself, his words incoherent but filled with a frantic energy. A woman in a faded dress sat clutching a bouquet of dead flowers, her eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. In the back corner, a teenager in a hoodie scribbled furiously in a notebook, his hands trembling. Emma tried to shake off her discomfort, telling herself it was just a late-night bus full of weary strangers. But then she noticed something else. The passengers weren't casting reflections in the windows. Her heart began to race. She turned her gaze to the driver, hoping for some reassurance, but his reflection was absent as well. Panic clawed at her chest, and she clutched her bag tightly, debating whether she should pull the cord and demand to get off. Before she could make a decision, the bus came to a sudden halt. The driver turned his head slightly, his voice gravelly and low. "This is your stop," he said. Emma looked around. No one else was moving, and the view outside the window was nothing but a dense wall of fog. She shook her head. "I didn't pull the cord," she said, her voice trembling. The driver didn't respond. The door creaked open, and the cold night air rushed in. "You should get off," he said, more firmly this time. Emma hesitated. The other passengers turned to look at her in unison, their faces expressionless, but their eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, something ancient and hungry. She bolted from her seat, clutching her bag as she stumbled out of the bus. The door slammed shut behind her, and the vehicle disappeared into the fog as quickly as it had arrived. Emma found herself standing on a narrow dirt path surrounded by tall, skeletal trees. The fog was so thick she could barely see a few feet ahead. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath her boots as she hesitantly began to walk. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, and the trees loomed closer with every step. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and she could hear faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As she continued, she saw a figure up ahead. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, standing motionless in the middle of the path. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Emma could feel his gaze locked onto her. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice shaking. "Can you tell me where I am?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed down the path. Emma followed his gesture and saw a faint light flickering in the distance. When she turned back to thank him, the man was gone. The whispers grew louder as she approached the light. They were indistinct at first, but soon she could make out fragments of sentences. "She doesn't belong here. Turn back before it's too late. We've been waiting." Emma's legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to keep moving. The light grew brighter, and she realized it was coming from a small, decrepit cabin. Its windows glowed with an unnatural, pulsating light that seemed to beckon her closer. She reached the cabin and hesitated at the door. The whispers had become a deafening cacophony, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her. Summoning her courage, she pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was nothing like she expected. It was vast, far larger than the structure's exterior suggested. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of murky liquid, each containing something indistinguishable but unsettling. The air was thick with the scent of decay. In the center of the room stood a figure shrouded in a tattered cloak. Their face was hidden, but their presence was overwhelming. Emma's instinct was to run, but her legs refused to move. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice echoing as if coming from a great distance. "We've been waiting for you." "Who are you?" Emma managed to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, they gestured to one of the jars on the shelf. Emma's eyes widened as she saw her own reflection in the glass. Her face contorted in silent terror. "Your journey isn't over," the figure said, "but you must choose." "Choose what?" Emma asked, panic rising in her chest. The figure extended a hand, and in their palm appeared two objects, a key and a shard of glass. "One will set you free, the other will bind you here forever." Emma stared at the objects, her mind racing. The whispers grew louder, each voice urging her in a different direction. She reached out, her hand trembling, and suddenly, the lights in the cabin dimmed, and a low growl resonated through the air. The figure's head snapped toward the door, as though sensing an intruder. The growl grew louder, closer, and the cabin began to shake. Jars fell from the shelves, shattering and releasing dark, writhing shapes that slithered into the shadows. Emma froze, her hand hovering over the key and the shard of glass. The figure turned back to her, their voice urgent now. "Choose quickly! It's coming!" "What's coming?" Emma shouted, panic overtaking her. Before the figure could respond, the door burst open, and a monstrous entity slithered into the cabin. It was an amalgamation of shadow and flesh, its form constantly shifting, with countless eyes blinking across its surface. The whispers turned into screams as the creature lunged forward. Emma snatched the key and stumbled backward, clutching it tightly. The figure raised their arms, chanting in a language Emma didn't recognize. A blinding light erupted from the key, forcing the creature to recoil. The figure turned to Emma, their voice echoing in her mind. "Run!" Emma didn't need to be told twice. She bolted out of the cabin, the key gripped tightly in her hand. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to block her path. The whispers followed her, mingling with the monstrous growls that echoed in the distance. The dirt path stretched endlessly before her, but Emma kept running. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding like a drum. She didn't dare look back, terrified of what she might see. As she ran, the key in her hand began to glow, illuminating the fog around her. The light revealed fleeting glimpses of shapes in the mist, faces distorted with anguish, hands reaching out as if begging for help. Emma tried to ignore them, focusing only on the path ahead. Eventually the forest began to thin, and the whispers grew fainter. Emma emerged into a clearing bathed in moonlight, the key's glow fading as it rested coolly in her palm. She collapsed to her knees, trembling, her eyes scanning the clearing for any sign of safety or danger. The whispers had stopped entirely now, leaving only the rhythmic thrum of her heartbeat in her ears. In the center of the clearing stood a stone pedestal, ancient and weathered, with intricate carvings spiraling up its sides. Atop it sat a keyhole, the perfect fit for the glowing key in her hand. Emma hesitated. This was it, the place she had been running toward, but also the place she had been warned about. Her mind raced with the memory of the old man's words. The key chooses its bearer, but not all who unlock the gate will survive what lies beyond. She hadn't understood at the time, but now, standing before the pedestal, she felt the weight of his warning pressing down on her like a storm cloud. A sudden chill swept through the clearing, and the faintest echo of a growl rolled through the trees behind her. Emma spun around, her breath catching in her throat. A pair of glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, followed by another and another. The figures that emerged were not human, but towering shadow beasts, their forms shifting and writhing as though made of living smoke. Emma turned back to the pedestal, her decision clear. Whatever was behind that gate, it had to be better than the nightmare advancing toward her. With trembling hands, she slid the key into the lock and twisted. The world erupted in light. The ground beneath her feet crumbled, and she felt herself falling, weightless, into a vast void. Colors swirled around her, golden, emerald, and sapphire hues blending into an endless vortex. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the deafening roar of the gate closing behind her. And then, silence. Emma landed hard on cool stone. She groaned, rolling onto her back, and blinked at the sky, or what she thought was the sky. Above her stretched an expanse of stars, but they moved, shifting and rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. The air was thick and hummed with energy. She pushed herself to her feet and looked around. She stood in what appeared to be a temple, its walls covered in glowing symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center of the room was a throne, and seated upon it was a figure cloaked in shimmering silver. The figure spoke, their voice both gentle and commanding. "Welcome, bearer of the key. You have entered the realm of thresholds, where the fate of worlds is decided. What is it you seek?" Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of the faces in the mist, of these beasts in the forest, of the life she had left behind. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "I seek answers," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos she had endured. "Why was I chosen? What is this place? And what am I supposed to do now?" The figure stood, their silver cloak rippling as if caught in an invisible wind. They extended a hand, and the key in Emma's pocket began to glow once more, lifting itself into the air and floating to the figure's outstretched palm. "You were chosen," they said, "because you are the last hope of your world. Beyond this temple lies the truth you seek, but with it comes a choice. Step forward, Emma, and let your journey truly begin." The walls of the temple shuddered, and a massive door at the far end creaked open, revealing an otherworldly landscape of floating islands and endless skies. Emma's heart raced, but this time it was not from fear. It was from the thrill of knowing that she had stepped into a story far greater than her own.